Longmont, Colorado, October 13, 2021. In the afternoon, emergency services were overwhelmed by a flood of calls from witnesses reporting an armed attack. In broad daylight, before their eyes, an unknown assailant shot a mail carrier at point-blank range. When police arrived at the scene, they saw a man in his early 30s lying sprawled on the ground in front of the mailboxes. He was still alive but bleeding heavily. Officers began administering first aid while waiting for paramedics to arrive. However, despite their desperate efforts to save him, he died within minutes. The man's colleagues and the post office manager who rushed to the scene could not believe what had happened when they identified the victim as their close friend and beloved co-worker, 33-year-old Jason Schaefer. While forensic specialists examined the crime scene, detectives spoke with witnesses who had been collecting their mail that day. One woman said she saw the postal van arrive and Jason begin sorting the mail. She picked up her letters and was already walking back to her house when she heard 5 gunshots. After that, she noticed a man running away, wearing a hoodie and a blue face mask. Another witness added that she had seen a dark figure standing on the opposite side of the street. The man was clearly waiting for something. Perhaps he was waiting for Jason to be alone before crossing the street. But what was he after? The mail carrier or the mail he was delivering? Since the killer fled on foot rather than by car, police hoped to intercept him quickly. A drone was deployed and K-9 units with tracking dogs searched for the shooter. Officers went door to door in the neighborhood, while local residents and school students were advised to remain in shelter. The officers still had one more difficult but necessary task: to inform Jason's family of his death. His mother, Lori Hebert, and his stepfather, Chris, lived in Connecticut. Investigators in Colorado asked their colleagues in Connecticut to notify them in person. Once Lori had somewhat calmed down after hearing the devastating news of her son's murder, she was able to answer the police officers' questions. She said that Jason was born on July 1st, 1988. Lori divorced Jason's father a year or two after he was born. But when Jason was 3 years old, his mother, who worked at the post office, fell in love with her colleague, Chris. Chris loved Jason deeply, and they became best friends. It was a very happy family. They all loved each other, and there were no problems or conflicts between them. Jason was 26 when he moved to Colorado and followed in the footsteps of his mother and stepfather. He got a job at the post office where he met Devin Schreiner. The two began dating. Jason introduced Devin to his parents, and they liked her. She was a simple, kind, and pleasant young woman. Soon, Devin told Jason that they were expecting a child. Jason, who had always dreamed of having a family, was overjoyed. His parents were happy for them as well. In 2015, Jason became the father of a wonderful baby boy. The child gave him a new sense of purpose in life, and he absolutely adored his son. However, a few years later, Jason and Devin separated. Despite this, Jason remained actively involved in his son's life. The young parents agreed on joint custody, and their son spent half the week with his father and the other half with his mother. Meanwhile, police were examining the crime scene. Nothing had been taken from Jason's van or his personal belongings, indicating that this was not a robbery. This narrowed down the list of suspects. The killer was likely someone Jason knew. The brutality of the attack pointed in the same direction. Jason had been shot 5 times at very close range, practically point blank, so close that powder burns were left on his forehead. The person who shot him was clearly enraged. He wanted the victim to see him before pulling the trigger. Police obtained footage from surveillance cameras located near the crime scene, including a doorbell camera that almost captured the attack on the victim. Officers saw that the killer crossed the street and deliberately approached Jason, fired 5 shots, and then ran away. The camera was not close enough to capture clear details of the suspect's appearance, but it did show the direction in which he fled. Thanks to another neighbor's surveillance camera farther down the street, officers observed that the suspect was wearing loose, dark-colored clothing. He had clearly done everything possible to conceal his identity. Since the footage confirmed that Jason himself was the intended target, detectives decided to speak with his family once again. The victim's mother, Lori, provided more details about her son's personal life, particularly the reasons behind Jason and Devin's breakup. After their child was born, it became clear that their values and priorities did not align. Woman did not want to work. She believed that, as a mother, she shouldn't have to. However, the Young family still had bills to pay, and their relationship began to deteriorate, eventually leading to their separation. Jason did his best to stay actively involved in his son's life, but despite the agreed custody arrangement, Devin often created obstacles. Unable to tolerate the situation any longer, Jason turned to a lawyer to have the court establish a new visitation plan and increase the amount of time he could spend with his son. Jason contacted the lawyer on October 11th, just 2 days before his death. It was now crucial for the police to determine whether Devin knew about this and how she had reacted. Moreover, Devin had another reason to be angry with Jason besides the custody issue. Jason's mother and stepfather said that the last time they saw him was 3 weeks earlier, when he came to visit them. They hadn't seen him that happy in a long time. Jason and his girlfriend Rosa had just moved into a larger apartment and were setting up a cozy home together. However, there was one complication. Rosa was Devin's younger sister. Jason's mother told him outright that this would not end well, but Jason was deeply in love with Rosa and didn't want to listen, even though he understood that it would only worsen his conflict with Devin. He had set his priorities, and his relationship with Rosa mattered more to him. His parents chose not to argue with him and simply shared in his happiness. Meanwhile, investigators now believed they needed to find out what Rosa had to say. Rosa worked at a daycare, and detectives met with her there. She had not yet learned that Jason had been killed, and the news devastated her. At the time of the attack, she had been at work, which her colleagues confirmed. Rosa told investigators that she and her sister had once been very close and had lived together, but they had a falling out, and Devin kicked her out of the house. It was clear that the reason for their conflict was Rosa's relationship with Jason. Perhaps Devin had hoped their affair would end quickly, but when Rosa moved in with Jason and it became clear that things were serious, she likely felt insulted and humiliated. All the facts uncovered by detectives suggested that Devin had several motives to want Jason dead. Therefore, it was crucial to immediately examine her movements on the day of the murder. However, since Devin had become a likely suspect, investigators needed to ensure Jason's son was safe. Detectives picked him up from his school in Longmont and took him to the station to make sure he was out of danger. Meanwhile, officers were reviewing all vehicles seen near the crime scene before and after the shooting. One of the cameras captured a black Nissan Rogue, missing a hubcap on the front right passenger side wheel, turning around at the end of the street and then driving off. The vehicle's position raised suspicion. It was spotted just 3 blocks south of the crime scene, in the same direction the shooter had fled immediately after the attack. The car then quickly left the area. Police soon discovered that Devin owned a black Nissan Rogue, and her vehicle was also missing a hubcap. If it was indeed her car, several important questions arose. Who had been behind the wheel, Devin herself or someone else? And what connection, if any, did she have to the man seen fleeing the scene? Detectives were very careful not to alert the suspect. They reached out to a postal inspector for assistance. After all, Devin also worked as a mail carrier and would have been delivering mail in her postal van that day. She was assigned to work in the city of Loveland, while the crime occurred 40 kilometers away in Longmont. The postal inspector obtained GPS data from Devin's mail scanner. What did it show? In the morning, at the start of her shift, she traveled along her regular route in Loveland. Later, she remained in one location for 40 minutes to an hour, precisely during the time Jason was killed. The drive from Loveland to Longmont would take her 40 minutes to an hour. In other words, carrying out the murder would have been entirely feasible for her. Of course, you can't hide the truth for long. Despite the officer's precautions, 4 hours after Jason's murder, Devin called the police. She had heard rumors that something had happened to her child's father and that her young son was at the station. Frustrated and confused, she didn't understand why she hadn't been contacted first. She agreed to come to the station, at least to pick up her son. There, she was informed that Jason had been killed and that her car had been spotted near the crime scene at the exact time of the armed attack. She was bewildered. She insisted she had no explanation. She had been at work in Loveland, and only she had the keys to her personal car. But the evidence seemed impossible. How could she have been in her postal van in Loveland just minutes before her Nissan appeared on cameras in Longmont? Yet she stood by her story. She explained that her scanner had not worked for about an hour because she had stopped for lunch at her boyfriend Andrew James Ritchie's house. His address was indeed on her route, and the scanner had stopped working right near his home. She arrived at 11:30 a.m. and left at 12:15 p.m. If this was true, she could not have killed Jason in Longmont at 12:33 p.m. Andrew could confirm her account, so the detectives arranged to meet with him next. But the detectives were completely unprepared for what Andrew would say. He spent the morning of October 13th at home. Devin did come by, but they did not have lunch. They argued. Devin was in love with Andrew and wanted to date him, but he considered them just friends. Andrew added that the last time he saw Devin, she was sitting in her postal van, crying after their argument. The time was around 12:15 p.m., which meant she could not possibly have been the shooter. As for lunch, he went out to eat at a Hooters fast food restaurant with his friends, arriving at 12:30 p.m. The restaurant had surveillance cameras, which conclusively confirmed that Andrew could not have been the killer either. In an instant, the detectives lost all their potential suspects. Yet, the glaring contradictions in the timelines troubled them. They decided to dig a little deeper. They obtained warrants for Devin's and Andrew's mobile carriers to get printouts of all their calls and messages. While the carriers prepared this information, officers examined the GPS data from their phones. Detectives found that on October 13th, the morning of the murder, both Devin and Andrew spent the morning at Devin's house. Andrew then drove Devin to her work in Loveland, after which they parted ways. Devin, as she had told police, got into her postal van and spent the morning delivering mail, but Andrew's movements stunned the detectives. They had GPS data from the victim's mail scanner and compared it with Andrew's phone data. Tracking the two men was chilling. Andrew had been closely following Jason all morning, shadowing him for several hours. But at noon, Andrew suddenly abandoned the surveillance, left Longmont, and headed straight to a fast food Hooters restaurant in Loveland, where he met his friends. But the police needed irrefutable evidence, and so far they could only prove that Jason's phone, not Jason himself, had been tracked that morning. They also didn't understand why his black Chevrolet Silverado never appeared on any surveillance footage. However, all morning a black SUV had been following Jason's van, bearing a distinct green and blue logo of the car-sharing company Way to Go. Detectives learned from the federal prison where Andrew worked as a corrections officer that employees there regularly used vehicles from that very company. The detectives were eager to see a full printout of Andrew's calls, but the mobile carrier still needed more time to process the data. To avoid alarming the suspect, they asked Andrew for permission to check his phone, and surprisingly, he agreed. It seemed he had forgotten about a screenshot he had taken in his Messenger app. On October 11th, 2 days before the crime, Andrew had captured a photo to save it. The first image showed a person taking a selfie in a bathroom, wearing clothes resembling those of the killer. Just a few minutes later, he received another photo and took a second screenshot. This time, the selfie clearly showed Devin in the same bathroom. To eliminate all doubt, detectives conducted a crime reconstruction. They asked a female officer of the same height as Devin to run across the street toward the postal van. When she aligned with the van, it became clear that Devin had indeed been at the crime scene. The fact that the photo was taken on October 11th indicated that Devin and Andrew had decided to get rid of Jason, not because he wanted more time with his son. While Jason had only just contacted his lawyer that day, the accomplices were already fully preparing for the attack. Finally, detectives received printouts of all calls and messages between the accomplices, which made their motives clear. Andrew was infatuated with Devin, obsessed with her, and willing to do anything for her. Devin, in turn, was angry at Jason because of his relationship with her younger sister. She complained to friends that it felt as though Jason, her sister, and her child now had their own family. Devin's narcissistic nature had been wounded, and she could not forgive what she saw as an insult. Her boyfriend, meanwhile, was willing to commit murder just to please her. Several months prior, the idea had emerged to kill both Jason and Rosa. A month before the attack, Andrew began studying the postal scanners to understand how they worked and to make necessary adjustments to their murder plan. That's why Devin left her scanner and phone at Andrew's house to create an alibi. But then why did Andrew take his own phone with him? Did he assume suspicion would never fall on him? The accomplices made several mistakes, yet it was clear they had planned Jason's murder carefully and over an extended period. The police now had enough evidence to question Andrew again. They confronted him with the location data from his phone and showed him the photos of Devon that he had carelessly saved. Hearing this, Andrew leaned back in his chair, sighed, and said he would tell everything. He admitted that he knew about Devon's plan to kill Jason, but claimed he had tried to dissuade her. He said that he had followed Jason that morning because he thought that if he spotted Devon's car, he could stop her. Of course, no one believed him. The accomplices were charged with first-degree murder. The trial of Devon began in February 2023. The prosecution did not have the murder weapon. It was never found. But they knew all the other details, including that the murder plan had been in motion since at least July. Devon saw killing Jason as the solution to all her problems. On the morning of the crime, Andrew dropped Devon off at her work in Loveland, while he drove to Longmont and shadowed Jason all morning. During this time, the accomplices were in constant phone contact. Andrew was essentially monitoring Jason's movements and keeping Devon informed, setting the stage for the murder she was to commit. At a certain point, Devon drove her postal van to Andrew's house, ended the call, and left her phone, scanner, and van there. She then got into her Nissan and headed to Longmont. Meanwhile, Andrew drove in the opposite direction to meet his friends at a restaurant. Devon parked in Longmont, walked 3 blocks north to where she knew Jason would be working, waited on the opposite street until he was alone, then approached him and shot him 5 times at close range. She wanted him to see who was pulling the trigger, to witness the hand that would end his life. Without regard for witnesses, she ran back to her car, drove to Loveland, and resumed her work. Devon Schreiner's trial lasted 5 days, but the jury took only 8 hours to convict her of first-degree murder. She will spend the rest of her life in prison without the possibility of parole. 6 months later, Andrew Ritchie's trial concluded with the same outcome. Devon was driven by wounded pride and a rage that blinded her to the consequences of her actions. It is striking how much effort she put into killing the father of her child, yet she gave no thought to the consequences for her own son. She took away a father who adored him and a mother who now has no realistic hope of ever regaining her freedom.